Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the 1995 album from Ken Ishii, Jelly Tones. Ken Ishii, okay then, this is another one that I'd previously never heard of that got requested of me quite a bit. At first I was just like, whatever, I'll get to it. And just kind of moved on and dealt with other things. But then I actually looked into the guy, and suddenly I realized this is the kind of artist I should have jumped into a lot earlier. This album here is an old techno classic from 1995, apparently, and as we all know, I love me some old 90s techno. I guess, though, I've tended to look into more English outfits in that regard, and Ken Ishii is obviously not English, he's Japanese. But when I got Jelly Tones and gave it one listen, I knew almost immediately this was not going to be one of those reviews that I could knock out quickly. The guy seems to have a pretty impressive back catalog, too. It seems like the perfect candidate for an artist I could cover in more detail another time. The more I look into the guy, the more interesting he looks. He's covered Mr. Fingers, Acid House Classic, Can You Feel It on one of his albums. The guy even got DJ Spooky and Talvin Singe to collaborate with him on one album. Those are two names I've known for a long time, but haven't thought about for a long time either. Whew. Both of those guys have excellent debut albums I recommend you check out, by the way. But, in the meantime, I'll focus on this album here, which was more or less the guy's commercial breakout, if you want to call it that. I think it was his third album overall. It's his earliest album that's basically available anywhere, and one of his only albums that's basically available anywhere too, but never mind that. His sound on this album, the best I can describe it is somewhere in between Ultimate Records and recent Black Dog. Maybe a tiny hint of Underworld in there too. And the synth tones are pretty bright and acid house, IDM-ish, as is the percussion. Actually, it's a lot like early Speedy J, like his Ginger and G-Spot albums, come to think of it. I probably should have started with that, but whatever. It's more or less a product of its time, but I've always liked this sound anyways. It's not the most serious of albums either, as you could probably guess from the title. There's 8 tracks, but they're all well fleshed out and interesting, the shortest being a little under 5 minutes. And I'll go down track by track. So it starts out with Extra, which sets the tone for the album. Warm synth pads, cool chilled out textures, and then pretty soon these big intense drum patterns come in and permeate the rest of the track, all with funky synth melodies interspersed throughout. Coco Mousse is a bit more laid back, with this cool guitar loop repeating throughout and other bubbly synths floating around, with the percussion mainly staying subdued. Stretch is where Ishii gets his Underworld on, with a fast-paced percussion track that heavily reminds me of Born Slippy Nux, albeit with a bit more cool melodies thrown around and no Carl Hyde half singing. Ethos is pretty similar, a little more focused on the synths than the percussion this time around, getting some artificial intelligence or maybe early Plaid vibes out of this one. The melodies are pretty high-pitched and light. Stretch and Ethos often kinda ran together for me, and I didn't notice where Ethos began the first couple of listens, but after a while I could kinda tell them apart. Then there's Moved by Air, which is a standout for sure. It's much slower with this big banging tribal percussion, aided by some kind of Indian tabla and mysterious synth pads, and maybe a barely audible guitar at the end of every beat loop. It's got a different vibe from most of the album, and I really like it. Pause and Herbs is similar to some of the earlier tracks on here. I'm getting maybe a tiny bit of like early Outer vibe out of this. Dense percussion patterns and almost atonal synth melodies, but a fairly lighthearted and spacey feel that we get out of everything else on here. Frame Out, meanwhile, is basically entirely a percussion track, with little to no actual melody. It's probably my least favorite on here because of that, but I do still like this one quite a bit too. The percussion patterns switch up at just the right pace for me to follow along. Finally, it all ends with Endless Season, which balances out the lack of melody on Frame Out by not being nearly as percussion heavy and focused around bright and repetitive synth melodies. This track is definitely where I got the strongest, like, Speedy J, Ginger vibes, Its chill atmospherics and lighthearted synths. A very nice track and a good place to end off this album. So, overall, I'd say I definitely enjoyed this album a lot. This guy, Ishii, definitely looks like the kind of guy that I would typically enjoy, and it seems that this is like just scratching the surface of what he has to offer. I've heard some small parts of his Future and Light and Sunriser albums as well, and it seems to be fairly similar. But yeah, I'm glad I sat down with this guy and looked into him. Granted, I still think Speedy J's Ginger is better than this. This took me like 3 or 4 listens to really fully get into, while Ginger I was head over heels in love at first listen. But on the other hand, Speedy J shot like way off into experimental territory after his first 2 albums, and then disappeared off the face of the earth. Meanwhile, Ishii seems to have not strayed that far from this sound. Well, maybe he hasn't, I haven't heard it yet, but regardless, I will have to keep this guy in mind whenever I'm in that kind of Speedy J mood. And to be fair, he's not like exactly like Speedy J. The guy definitely has his own style that I can pick up on, but I'm looking forward to checking out the guy's other stuff, and I would definitely recommend this to all you IDM and Acid House fans out there. I'm overall feeling an 8.3 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.